it is not required to recruit any further reference individuals for this study. What is required probably then is to confirm the reference interval after it is being accepted. So how this is done is essentially very simple. If you looked at a linear regression line, section 10.1 will give you two examples. You will look at the slope of your linear regression line and as well as the intercept. If the correlation is good, you can essentially use your slope and intercept as your transfer of the current laboratory's reference interval to the new reference interval based on method comparisons. So in section 10.1, they will also give you some don'ts to look out for to ensure that this is essentially valid. And of course, at the end of acceptance, this reference interval needs to be confirmed with actual clinical samples. Section 10.2 is a more favorable alternative for most laboratories right now. They will establish the reference interval for transference based on the comparability of test populations. There are three methods of doing this. The first is known as subjective, which means it is essentially paperwork documentation that you probably need to use, and it will be transferred from the existing reference intervals that they are either using or a site that is a reference site to the current lab's reference interval. In section 11.2, it mentions that you can use a small number of reference individual, in this case, n equals to 20. So in section 11.3, there is an alternative to use a number of reference intervals. This is for cases where the assay is of critical concern for clinical interpretation, as stated in section 11.3. Okay, going back to NUHS for an example, I think this is good because it is very clear. The site tells you what is needed, tells you the acceptance criteria for your samples. This will ensure that the uniformity of the sample that comes into the lab, and this will also allow people to understand how to mimic the conditions of the reference site. So these are important. So when you look at potentially a reference site, the instructions has to be clear, all the way from pre-analytics to analytics of the sample, to results, and to reporting of the results. Okay, definitions of reference interval. It is essentially when we look at reference individuals, they are from the reference population, right? And in our reference interval establishment, we built up a reference sample group that we say and assume are part of the reference population. From the reference group, we build and establish the reference values, as we will see an example later. And in this case, we of course need to check the distribution. And then from the distribution, look at the limits. That essentially becomes our reference interval. And in this process, we are able to confirm, and we are able to use that level to address a clinical interpretation. And before this is accepted for the lab, the request is always to have an observed value to compare. So this is your validation. In section 9.1, CRSI AP 28, for general practice, the working group supports a minimum of 120 reference subjects. There is also the need to pay attention to subclass of reference intervals. We will see what are subclasses later. Okay, I'm just hoping to simplify how we can build that reference interval, and then we can focus more on documentation and examples. Okay, when we look at building that reference interval, we want to, of course, plan and of course, get the buy-in of all the stakeholders. Then you establish your sample size. You follow, of course, section 9.1. So this is your data. And then you will be performing your analysis. The first analysis that you would do is to look at outliers. In section 9.2, it gives you an example. Section 9.3 tells you how to look at subclass, or in this case, for example, when we looked at FBC, we understand that for the pediatric population, for the adult population, and for the geriatric population, there could be site differences. So these are all your different subclasses. And section 9.3 gives you a little bit of instructions how to identify those subclasses. And in the example that I will show you later, you will have probably an idea on how I looked at subclasses as well. And of course, with that, it's all software at work. You can build this in Excel. You can. Most people use SPSS or MedCal software to look at this. Of course, analyze it using Excel also is useful. I use Prism because since grad school, I've been using this software. It is an old version. I think Sysmex Malaysia bought Prism as well. It is a very simple to use, but it's really anything you're comfortable with. What this software helps you is to look at all your data, crunch it based on certain test methods, and gives you, of course, your reference interval. And finally, it is a continuous process because the reference interval needs to be checked at, for example, if you have an instrument change, they will require you that you verify or re-establish your reference interval. In certain hospitals, certain laboratories, they will do periodic regular checks that will ensure that the reference interval is always up to date. It is important because if you now go back to ISO 15189 for the laboratory, if the laboratory is participating to get certification for ISO, it also gives you a very detailed list of what you need to prepare for reference interval documentation. And CLSI EP28 is sufficient, I would say, if you are able to follow all the section guidelines to build that documentation for ISO 15189. Okay, this really brings me back to proper documentation because that's where I see a lot of figures when we are building reference interval. I do not really see the documentation. So I think it is important to stress you will need proper documentations because these are things that you will fall back on when you are looking at the previous establishment and further refinement down the road. It really starts off at the beginning of where you have a standard operating procedure with relevant stakeholder buy-ins. This will include everybody, including the person who takes the blood even. And of course, you will want to define, it is a very, I'll say a small project, but very intensive, where you will need to define, of course, a time frame, where and when the study will be conducted. These are all basic things. I got this from a journal. If you're interested, you can request it either directly or through the app. If you clicked on one of the icons, you can probably see this as one of the citations. That will link you to an email request. Okay, then the few questions that you will need to ask before you really start on building this. And I would definitely encourage you to document all the thinking steps so that you will know that these are all in place. For example, if you look at point 3, IRB approval given, this is important because this is ethical compliance. In all the things that we do, especially with patients, especially even with healthy individuals, we need to ensure that there is ethical compliance. Different countries will have different levels of compliance requirements. This is definitely required. So if you do not have IRB approval, please do not start. If IRB waiver can be achieved, definitely it will be useful. Okay, just also to share with you, I'm not sure if anybody has read the Declaration of Helsinki, which governs how we looked at trials for with human subjects included. If you look at residual blood samples, there is a slide that mentions that these are probably samples that will be discarded otherwise after the test. Residual samples are, of course, your routine samples that comes into the lab that completed the testing, which are then discarded as per a biohazard waste. So to use residual samples, if you now look at a number of different publications and recommendations from different governing bodies, they encourage governing bodies to adopt a waiver for residual samples. I think this is fair because no patient identifiers are typically used. That is also one problem when we are establishing reference interval, because I do need a certain number of patient demographic details when you build that reference interval. Okay, point 4 is important. Questionnaire, because this really helps you and helps the person who wants to build, and it also helps even auditors for ISO to understand when we establish the RI, is it up to standard? Okay, for the rest, I'll leave you to read. It is quite self-explanatory. Just want to bring you to a plan. Of course, it starts off with your inputs when you initiate and plan for building that reference interval. It is a simple systems diagram if you look at how reference intervals can be built. When you execute, you need to ensure that before you execute, you know what you want to monitor and control. Because if you do not know what you want to monitor and control, you will be getting results blindly. That is difficult because if you want to then get information after that, it will be a very big challenge. So inputs, execute, monitor and control goes back to your plan. If you have everything in place, make sure then you can probably execute properly. And I would definitely think that you will have a good closing for this reference interval building. Okay? And of course, it really boils down to customer satisfaction in the end. Reference interval is the scope is important. Of course, you want to build it fast. Stakeholder buy-in is important because if they don't help you, your results will be patchy. Of course, in certain cases, there will be costs involved. The size of the circle probably mean the importance of the different aspects. I would think in most cases, I need the buy-in of the stakeholders as the first step, because if I don't get their approvals, it's difficult for me to even get good data out of it. And then, of course, you want to ensure that your schedule is not too long, because when we are establishing RIs for a new lab, probably they will require this as soon as possible so that they can put your instruments online as soon as possible. Okay, and we talked about questionnaires earlier. Okay, this came from one of the publications that was addressed earlier. Sorry, I forgot to list down the citation. I can give you the citation later. And this came from CLSR EP28. These are recommended questions. These are suggested questions. I would say it will differ from the different parameters you are trying to establish. For the one on the left, it is for establishing coagulation reference intervals. There are some questions that are probably common to all questionnaires that could probably help you. So this is important because it will help you to ensure that these patients have no underlying conditions. These patients are indeed healthy individuals when we looked at reference intervals. This questionnaire also will help you to do the first line of filter of data when you have data. And if you now looked at